Hi, I'm Jessica Lyons, Cybersecurity Editor with the Register. I'm talking with Joe Sullivan, the former Chief Security Officer at Uber. So, Joe, back in October 2022, you were found guilty of charges related to covering up Uber's 2016 data breach. And then last year in May, you were sentenced to probation, community service, no prison time. But I was hoping you could take us back to that time period and tell us what that was like for you.
Okay, so I think you're talking about the period between the jury verdict and the sentencing hearing.
Yes.
It was, well, that was probably one of the toughest times of my life because, we all go through life hoping that we have a sense of control in our future, and I didn't. I didn't know what the future was going to hold. I couldn't go take on any big commitments in the world because there was a real chance that the judge could sentence me to prison. The United States Department of Justice was preparing to go to court and was arguing in court that I should be sentenced to prison for 18 months is what they argued in court. And before that, they had signaled that they were going to argue for even more. So it was an extended period of time. It was almost 8 months, I think. And through that process, I went through, a lot of different steps. The hard part was dealing with the uncertainty, but someone gave me really good advice, which is when you have very difficult situations ahead of you, actually list out what the practical worst case scenario would be, and then deal with it and go through the act of thinking through, okay, if the worst case happens, which in my case, it meant I had to study the different prisons that I could ask the judge to be sentenced to, because the judge can recommend which prison you go to. And obviously I wanted, if I had to go, I wanted to be near my family so that they could visit and things like that. And then there are all these other factors that people start talking about when you look at prisons. And I don't recommend anybody spend time looking at prisons because it's not something good. So I did, so that, the one hand, that's what I was worrying about and thinking about. But on the other hand, there was this amazing thing that happened that I had no idea was going to happen, which was I started getting letters and emails. People were sending me letters to give to the judge, asking for lenience in my case. At the end of the day, I think we gave 187 letters to the judge, and one was signed by 60 people, another signed by 40 people. So, and then there were probably another 50 letters that I didn't submit because they were kind of more generic, not telling real personal stories. And I didn't want to, I knew the judge, my lawyer said we should only submit less than 100 because we'll annoy the judge. And I said, I want to submit everything that is real, meaningful, thoughtful letter from someone who took the time to write it. And the amazing thing was the judge took the time to read all those letters as well. But during that 8-month period, I'd go through some pretty depressed periods of time thinking about what might happen. And then one of these letters would show up and it would tell a story about something that I didn't necessarily remember, but it made me feel good. I talked about it with people at the time. It felt like I was at my own Irish wake where I got to hear good stories and have people speak up about my relationship with them. And, so I wish everybody could go through that without having to go through the other half of what I had to go through.
Right?
Yeah.
And my understanding is that over 100, something like 150 of these were from other chief security officers or CISOs who were writing and supporting you. And this, in addition to obviously having a really personal effect on you, this sent shockwaves kind of throughout the security exec community. Because it was, in my understanding, it's the first time that a U.S. chief security officer has faced criminal charges related to a breach at their organization. So what was the response, not just from a personal level, but kind of on a professional level that you also were hearing from these executives and what it meant for the larger community?
Yeah, it's a really important question, I think, because we're in this place right now where security leaders are worried about their personal risk. and they feel there's a tension between protecting themselves and doing their best at work, and that's not the place we want to be. It was interesting. I got a lot of funny questions from security executives during that period of time. And by funny questions, I mean they wanted to know, could I write a letter that only you and the judge see and no one else sees, because I don't want my boss or my company to know I'm writing the letter. And it's the same thing that I see today, now a year later. CISOs don't necessarily see the world and the world of regulation the way their corporations do. And I think more CISOs want clear and more regulation than their companies do. And so they wanted to speak up and they wanted to talk to the judge about the world that the CISO lives in. I think that it's for those of us inside the field, it's a well understood set of challenges. But for those who don't know our world, it seems strange. But I'll just say it, like, most security leaders don't get the resources to do the job well, and they fight really hard with the resources they have to get the most they can done. In corporations, corporations are rational economic engines. Like they spend money on things that make more money, and they spend money on things that they have to exist. So if you have to do it because the law says you do it, then they'll spend it on it. And every other dime will go to making more money, because that's, they're there to generate more money. If they're a public company, Wall Street's pushing them. That's why we see so many stories about companies doing layoffs right now, because they're trying to be economically rational in the eyes of their investors and Wall Street and their top execs. And so sometimes decisions that we don't agree with get made. And the reality is we don't have comprehensive cybersecurity mandates in law in this country for corporations. And Congress has never stepped up and given us, like, say, the equivalent of a European GDPR, but for security, we don't have a privacy either. And so corporations kind of look at what do we actually have to spend money on from a security standpoint, and they'll spend that and not a dime more. So you have these security leaders who are sitting inside. They never get the budget they ask for. They're doing the best they can. And then they feel like the world on the outside looks at them and says, well, you have this title of chief security, and you didn't deliver it. You're in trouble. And that's what they worry about. And so a lot of security leaders wanted to speak up in my case and talk about that situation, but they were uncomfortable raising their personal voice.
So I want to talk more about this increased risk that chief security officers face and the liabilities that they potentially face too. But first, back to what you were saying about we don't have something like the GDPR in the U.S. Should we have some type of federally mandated requirements or security minimum standards? What do you think on that?
If we want it, we have to mandate it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that obviously not every piece of legislation around cybersecurity has been good. We look at some of the frameworks for compliance as examples, and some of them haven't been very good when they've, for example, when they've prescribed a very specific type of encryption that becomes outdated 3 years later. You don't want that written into the law. So there's good and bad ways to approach legislation. But one example area that people have been talking about a lot lately has been in the context of the Sarbanes-Oxley evolution that happened over in the finance world. If we go back 25 years ago, the world of finance was not as simple and well executed inside our corporations as it is today, because there was not a Sarbanes-Oxley. It took Enron and some, situations where Congress and the public said enough is enough. We're going to mandate that corporations must do a bunch of very concrete, objective, measurable things around financial controls. Sarbanes-Oxley came into law, and I don't think it was as clear on day one as it is now, but I've been through IPOs at multiple companies, and what I saw was when we were thinking about becoming a public company, the company invested a lot in our financial controls, and we had outside auditors, and the CEO had to sign on the line that the controls were in place and that the numbers were accurate. And it led to investors having much more confidence in the markets and companies being more stable and a lot less Enron-like situations. So, we look at it now and it feels like Sarbanes-Oxley was like a crisp, clean thing. It wasn't. It was a messy 20-year journey on the finance side. And what we're going through on the security side is a little bit of the same. It's going to be a messy, long journey. I think that we have regulators who are stepping in and trying to create some bright lines, but they're doing it through regulation, not legislation. And they're doing it through actions, trying to set precedent through cases rather than Congress. And, at the end of the day, congressional laws are typically clearer and more bright line than what we're going to get with case law and, arbitrary enforcement. And not arbitrary, but, kind of arbitrary enforcement actions. And so I think a lot of us would like clear legislation.
And so talking about precedent, definitely with your case, we also saw over the last year with SolarWinds CISO Tim Brown, the SEC filing a lawsuit against him, essentially saying he didn't do his job in the lead up to the SolarWinds 2020 supply chain attack. I read a story yesterday that found 70% of 1,600 CISOs surveyed said that they're worried about suffering a material breach this year, and 66% of them are worried about the liability that they may experience from that too. So talk a little bit about the pressure that CISOs are under, what's just doing their job. Like you said, they don't have enough resources. What's this like and feel like?
Yeah, it's interesting. These enforcement agencies that are bringing the actions, they've gotten a top-down mandate from the Department of Justice, from the White House, to bring these actions, to raise the bar. The Biden administration national cybersecurity policy document that came out last March is very clear. It says we need to shift responsibility and accountability to the organizations that can afford it. And they don't mean the government, and they don't mean small businesses, and they don't mean consumers. They mean the large corporations that control most of the data and most of the pipes of the internet. And so, the government also has a second mandate, which is bring enforcement actions against people, not just corporations, because over the years, we've learned that enforcement actions against corporations don't necessarily change corporate behavior. At least that's what they say in the government documents. And so we're seeing many more of these enforcement actions being brought in different contexts, not just against CISOs, but against executives as individuals. And so that's what's scaring these security leaders, because they're in this situation where, on the one hand, we want expectations to get higher. We want better budgets. We want better tools. But on the flip side, we want a world to understand that that these security leaders are the champions inside the company fighting to get these things done. And just because they didn't succeed doesn't mean that they weren't trying as hard as they could.
So who should take responsibility? I think that the buck has to stop with somebody. It seems like maybe CISOs kind of tend to be the fall guys. Does it stop with the CEO? Who should take accountability in a situation where there is a major breach?
Well, what I hope happens in the SolarWinds case when they go and dig in is I hope that they see that Tim and his team were working really hard, doing the best they could with the resources they had. I don't have inside information on what happened there, but everything I've seen is that was a team of people who really cared about security, and they probably asked for lots of resources that they didn't get, and they probably, I think, did the best they could with what they had, which wasn't good enough. Now it's hard. Like, one of the hard things is, we're looking at the actions of a company, SolarWind, in 2019. And 2018 and, in those years. And it's really hard to roll back and look at the world of 4 or 5 years ago. And I saw that happening in my case too. The nature of these cases takes 4 or 5 years for them to kind of get through the process. And at the end of it, though, I betcha that there are a lot of organizations that are doing a lot better job today at security with top-down investments because the SolarWind case was brought. And so, That's actually a good thing. But I don't think any CISO in 2019, was thinking about liability and was pushing the company that hard because they didn't know the enforcement actions were coming against them. So hopefully we don't see a lot of more enforcement actions in the short term, and they kind of take it as like, all right, we've pushed the companies, they're on notice. Now let's start looking at their behavior in 2024 and 25, not kind of like, let's not go rehash a bunch of other security incidents from 3 or 4 years ago. So where should the responsibility go? I think the responsibility has to stop at the top. And CEOs and board members are the ones who make the decision on how budget is allocated. They're the ones who need to hear the message that if you don't fund it, you're accountable for it. And so I think it's going there. And we can see trends for that. I'll give you a few concrete examples. Number one, the judge in my case, at my sentencing hearing, turned to the prosecutor and made them really uncomfortable with a series of questions saying, why isn't the CEO here? And really pushed them. I think this judge was communicating to a lot more than just me at my sentencing hearing. I think the judge was talking to the government. I think the judge was talking to CISOs in general. And one of the things that the judge wanted to make clear was, in a situation like this, where the security executive kept the CEO in the loop and got a CEO approval for everything, why isn't the CEO in the courtroom? That's an example from a year ago of the judge. The FTC in the Drizzly case held the CEO accountable for the security practices, and those consequences travel with that CEO. Even CISA in their recent secure by deny. They just at the big security conferences 3 weeks ago had a big event where they had companies sign on to commit to doing secure by design in their software development. Who did they ask to sign those commitments? The CEOs. They didn't ask CISOs to sign them. They asked the CEOs. And so we're seeing over and over now what I think we need to see is the CEOs knowing that they're the top person at the corporation. They need to make sure that security is prioritized. And then I know lots of CISOs who are looking forward to being able to be in the situation where they have a fully supportive CEO on board.
What about the SEC's, a year old at this point, disclosure guidelines for publicly traded companies if they experience a material breach? Is that helping? Is that making us safer?
You know what? I think it's... so mixed feelings, but I think it's a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Mixed feelings because I don't think it's a perfect step in the right direction, and there are more steps that need to follow. But you know what? If you look at the SEC and you say they've done two different things in cybersecurity in the last 18 months, 2 years, whatever it is, one being this regulatory approach where they put out some proposed regulations, got feedback, iterated, and then went out with now what we could call V1 of those guidelines that have really only been in effect since last December. Mm-hmm. Now we've gotten 6 months of seeing what companies are it seems like a lot of companies are stepping forward and saying, I'm going to do a disclosure. I don't think it meets the materiality standard, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think Microsoft even said that in their disclosures about recent stuff. They said it doesn't meet the materiality threshold, but we're going to give some transparency. I've read a lot of those disclosures. They haven't been very helpful substantively at the end of the day when you look at them. But I also don't know what's going on behind the scenes. How is the SEC following up with these people? What kind of engagement and conversations are happening? But you know what? At a minimum, we know companies are saying more about what's happening from a security standpoint. And the reality is transparency is good. The more companies that share the things they're going through, the better the other companies that haven't experienced it yet will learn from the attacks that others have seen. We've had this information kind of like imbalance. The bad guys share, the good guys don't. We need the good guys to be sharing and working collaboratively. And so we're getting a little bit in the right direction with more transparency. Number two, the number of conversations and the people involved in the conversations that are happening inside corporations are better than ever before. CISOs are standing up inside their corporation and saying, it's not my job to decide what's material or not, because this is a financial thing, and so the CFO has to be involved and the CEO has to be involved. So even V1 is forcing much deeper conversations inside these corporations with the people that we want to have at the table more than we've had in the past. So actual outcome in terms of the transparency and stuff like that, not a major step in the right direction yet, but I tend to think of this as V1 of an iterative process that hopefully will get better over time.
So what does need to happen then to make us safer? You talked about transparency is good. Bigger budgets would be useful as well. What needs to happen to get to that place where we're putting a dent in the problem?
Yeah. So, what we've seen from the government recently is carrots and sticks. And these enforcement actions, those are the sticks. Those are the scary side of it. Ideally, we have more carrots as well. We need to create incentives for companies to be transparent and to come forward without fear. When I was on President Obama's Cyber Commission in 2016, one of the things we talked about a lot was how do we create those incentives? Because I think back then the government wasn't ready to kind of move to the stick direction. But I think, times have changed and security hasn't improved enough. So government's using the tools they have to force some changes. But for example, giving companies immunity for coming forward quickly, if they could share information that would help other companies avoid the problem that they had, things like that reward and promote the best behaviors, celebrating companies that do a good job on security. Like we haven't seen that side of it enough, and we need to do more of that.
Right. So looking back at your experience and where we are now, what's the biggest lesson that you've learned, and what advice would you want to give to your fellow CISOs and CSOs?
Yeah, I think it's really important that security leaders not look at the environment right now and throw up their hands and quit. We can't afford to lose these really talented people who are technical, but leaders who are very mission-driven kind of people. Like most people who go into security go because it's a cool technical world, but you're helping people. Like the reason why you do security is your mission every day is to make sure that somebody doesn't get hurt. It's all about prevention. And there are a lot of great people in this world doing this work who are kind of leaning back instead of leaning forward because they're afraid for themselves. We need them to be motivated and excited and running to work, not thinking about changing profession, because these people are the people that are going to keep us safe. But we need to have a partnership between those people in the companies and the government. And I think some of the government agencies like CISA have been working really hard to try and partner with the private sector. And some are just focused on enforcement and threats. And we've got to navigate that and kind of like reduce some of the tension a little bit and get back to like talking about collaboration.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. Good talking with you.
Thank you for having me on.